The rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Morrison mansion as Richard sat alone in his leather chair, still wearing his black funeral suit. The house felt different now, empty. Even with its 30 rooms and priceless paintings on every wall, it seemed smaller somehow, colder. Just 6 hours ago, he had watched them lower his beloved wife into the ground. 52 years of marriage gone in the span of 18 months since her diagnosis. The cancer had taken her slowly, but their love had remained strong until her very last breath. Richard rubbed his weathered hands together and looked around the living room. Everything reminded him of Helen. Her favorite blue vase sat on the mantel, still holding the white roses he had brought her every Friday for 5 decades. Her reading glasses lay folded on the side table next to her favorite mystery novel, bookmarked at page 143. She would never finish it now. At 78 years old, Richard had built an empire in real estate that made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. But wealth meant nothing when you had no one to share it with. No children had blessed their marriage despite years of hoping. Helen had always said they were meant to pour their love into other people's lives instead. Now, sitting in the silence, Richard wondered what Helen would want him to do with all this money. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times. Mrs. Chen, his housekeeper and caretaker, knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Morrison, you should eat something. I made your favorite soup." Richard managed a small smile. Mrs. Chen had been with them for 15 years, watching over their home with the dedication of family. She had cried harder than anyone at the funeral today except for him. "Thank you, but I'm not hungry right now," he replied softly. Mrs. Chen stepped into the room, her kind eyes full of concern. "Helen would not want you to waste away. You know this, she was right, of course." Helen had always worried about him working too much, eating too little, forgetting to take care of himself when he got lost in business deals. Even in her final weeks, weak from treatments, she had reminded him to eat his vegetables and take his heart medication. After Mrs. Chen left, Richard walked to his study and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Helen had kept detailed records of everyone who had shown them kindness over the years. She called it her gratitude journal. He flipped through page after page of her neat handwriting, remembering each person she had written about. There was Nancy, the nurse who had worked the night shift during Helen's treatments. While other nurses rushed through their duties, Nancy always took time to ask about their grandchildren they never had, and listened patiently to Helen's stories about their travels. She never made Helen feel like a bother, even when the pain kept her awake and calling for help every hour. Then there was Betty, the cashier at their local grocery store. For 20 years she had greeted them by name, asked about Helen's garden, and remembered that Richard preferred paper bags because they were easier for his arthritis to carry. Last month, when Helen was too sick to leave the house, Betty had personally delivered their groceries and refused to accept a tip. Richard thought about Grace, their neighbor from across the street. When Helen first got sick, Grace had appeared at their door every Tuesday with homemade chicken soup and fresh bread. She never asked for anything in return, never made them feel like charity cases. She simply said that neighbors help neighbors, and that was that. Finally, there was Linda, the librarian at the downtown branch where Helen had volunteered reading to children for 30 years. When Helen became too weak to continue, Linda visited her at home every week, bringing new books and reading them aloud. She had even organized a special ceremony where the children sent Helen handmade cards telling her how much her story, time had meant to them. These 4 women had brightened Helen's final months in ways that money could never buy. They had given freely of their time, their hearts, and their compassion without expecting anything in return. Richard realized they represented everything Helen had always believed about human kindness. He picked up his phone and called his financial advisor, Thomas. It was late, but Thomas had been handling the Morrison family finances for 25 years and wouldn't mind the call. "Thomas, I need you to do something unusual for me," Richard said when the sleepy voice answered. "Of course, Mr. Morrison, what do you need?" "I want you to set up 4 separate accounts, each with $50,000 deposited monthly. Then I want you to create unlimited credit cards linked to these accounts." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, unlimited credit cards can be very risky." "What's this for?" Richard looked at Helen's photograph on his desk. In it, she was laughing at something he had said during their honeymoon in Paris. Her eyes sparkled with the joy that had made him fall in love with her 60 years ago. I want to give them to 4 very special women. They showed my Helen and me more kindness than we ever deserved. I want to see what happens when good people are given the chance to do whatever their hearts tell them to do. Mr. Morrison, with respect, this could be expensive, very expensive. Are you sure about this? Richard had never been more sure of anything in his life. Helen always said that money is just paper, unless it helps someone smile. These women made her smile during the hardest time of her life. Now I want to give them the power to make others smile too. The next morning, Richard sat in his study writing 4 identical letters. His handwriting was shaky, but his words were clear. Dear friend, you may not remember me, but I remember your kindness. You touched my life and my wife's life in ways you'll never know. This card has no limit and no strings attached. Use it however your heart guides you. The world needs more people like you, from someone whose life you've changed. Forever. He sealed each letter in an expensive envelope and attached it to a black credit card with the woman's name embossed in gold. Letters. Mrs. Chen found him there an hour later, staring at the 4 packages lined up on his desk. What are these for? She asked. Richard looked up at her with eyes that held more life than they had in months. These are for hope, Mrs. Chen. Helen always believed that kindness creates more kindness. I'm about to find out if she was right. That afternoon, Richard personally delivered each package to its intended recipient. He didn't wait to see their reactions. Instead, he drove home through the quiet streets wondering if he was crazy or brilliant. Maybe both. But for the first time since Helen's death, he felt like he had a purpose again. He had no idea that this simple act of gratitude would change not only 4 lives, but his own life in ways he never could have imagined. Nancy Williams had just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital when she found the elegant black envelope tucked under her apartment door. Her feet ached, her uniform was wrinkled, and all she wanted was a hot shower and her bed. But something about the expensive-looking envelope made her pause. She kicked off her nursing shoes and sat on her worn couch, turning the envelope over in her hands. Her name was written in shaky but careful handwriting across the front. No return address. No postmark. Someone had delivered this by hand. Inside, she found a credit card that felt heavier than normal cards, along with a handwritten letter. As she read the words, her heart began to race. An unlimited credit card? No strings attached? This had to be some kind of scam. Nancy grabbed her laptop and spent the next 2 hours researching credit card fraud. She read horror stories about people who used mysterious cards only to find themselves drowning in debt later. But when she called the number on the back of the card, a real bank representative confirmed it was genuine and linked to an account with her name on it. This can't be right, she whispered to herself. Things like this don't happen to people like me. Nancy thought about her student loans from nursing school, $43,000 still hanging over her head after 5 years of payments, her beat-up car that needed new brakes, her mother's medical bills from last year's surgery. But she was too scared to use the card. What if it was a mistake? What if someone came looking for the money later? Across town, Betty Martinez was having her morning coffee when her daughter knocked on the door with a package. Mom, this was on your porch. Looks fancy. Betty had been working at the grocery store for 22 years, and in all that time, the fanciest thing she had ever received was a fruit basket from her manager at Christmas. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. When she saw the credit card, her first thought was that someone was playing a cruel joke on her. Betty had never owned a credit card in her life. She paid for everything with cash or her debit card because she was terrified of debt. Her husband had left them drowning in credit card bills 15 years ago, and she had spent years digging out of that hole. She immediately called her son, Miguel, who worked at a bank downtown. Mijo, I need you to look at something. Someone sent me a credit card, but I think it might be fake. Miguel came over during his lunch break and examined the card carefully. Mom, this looks real. The bank name is legitimate, but you should be careful. Let me call them and verify it for you. After 30 minutes on the phone with the bank, Miguel hung up with a shocked expression. Mom, it's real. The account has $50,000 in it right now, and they said more gets added every month. But Mom, who would do this? Do you know anyone with this kind of money? Betty shook her head, but deep down she wondered if it had something to do with the elderly couple who used to shop at her store. The husband had seemed so lost after his wife died. She remembered him standing in the cereal aisle last week, just staring at a box of the oatmeal his wife used to buy, tears running down his cheeks. Meanwhile, Grace Thompson was in her backyard garden when her mailman handed her the special envelope. At 65, Grace had lived in the same house for 40 years and knew everyone on the block. She couldn't imagine who would send her something so formal-looking. Reading the letter, Grace felt a mix of confusion and fear. She had heard about elderly people being targeted by scammers, and this seemed too good to be true. Her late husband had always told her that if something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. But Grace also remembered Helen Morrison, her neighbor who had died recently. That sweet woman who used to wave from her window every morning when Grace worked in her garden. Grace had started making extra soup after Helen got sick, because she knew how hard it was to cook when you were dealing with illness. Her own husband had gone through cancer treatment 10 years ago, and she remembered those exhausting days. Grace decided to take the card to her bank branch and ask them to check it in person. She didn't trust phone calls when it came to money matters. The young banker who helped her seemed as surprised as she was when the account information appeared on his screen. "Mrs. Thompson, this is definitely real. The account is fully funded and there don't appear to be any catches or fees. Someone has given you a very generous gift." Grace sat in her car in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to process what this meant. She thought about her daughter who lived 3 states away, struggling to pay for her son's college tuition. She thought about the food bank where she volunteered, always running short on supplies. She thought about her neighbor's house that still needed roof repairs after last year's storm. Linda. Foster was cataloging returned books when a colleague brought her the envelope that had been left at the main desk. As the head librarian, Linda was used to receiving official correspondence. But this looked different, personal. She waited until her lunch break to open it. Sitting in the quiet corner of the library where she used to read to children before the pandemic changed everything. When she read the letter, she immediately thought it was some kind of marketing scheme. Credit card companies were always trying new ways to get people to sign up, but Linda was thorough by nature. She researched the bank, called their fraud department, and even looked up the account routing numbers. Everything checked out. The card was real, the money was real, and someone had chosen her specifically. Linda thought about the children she used to read to during story time. So many of them came from families who couldn't afford books at home. She had started a small program with her own money, buying used books to send home with kids, but she could only help a few families each month. She also thought about the literacy classes she taught at the community center on weekends. Adult students who were learning to read later in life, often embarrassed about their struggles but determined to improve. They needed books, supplies, and sometimes just encouragement. Over the next few days, all 4 women found themselves thinking constantly about the mysterious card. Nancy kept it hidden in her jewelry box, afraid to touch it. Betty showed it to her priest, asking if it would be wrong to use money from an unknown source. Grace researched the Morrison family online and figured out the connection. Linda made lists of all the ways such money could help her community programs. Each woman wrestled with the same questions. Why them? What did the giver expect in return? Was it safe to use? What would happen if they made the wrong choice? Finally, after a week of sleepless nights and constant worry, Nancy made the first purchase. She paid for her car repairs, holding her breath as she handed over the card. When the transaction went through without any problems, she felt a mix of relief and guilt. Betty bought groceries for Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who lived down the street and was too proud to ask for help. Grace paid for her grandson's school supplies that her daughter couldn't afford. Linda ordered a box of new children's books for the library's reading program. Small purchases at first, careful steps into unknown territory, none of them knowing that someone was watching their choices with growing pride and hope. The 4 women had no idea that their lives were about to change in ways they never could have imagined, or that their mysterious benefactor was about to learn something beautiful about the power of kindness passed forward. 3 months had passed since the 4 women received their mysterious gifts, and Richard Morrison found himself looking forward to something for the first time since Helen's death. Every evening he would sit in his study with Mrs. Chen, reviewing the monthly account statements that his financial advisor sent over. "Look at this one," Richard said, pointing to a line item on Nancy's account. "She paid for someone's emergency room visit, $3,000. Mrs. Chen adjusted her reading glasses and smiled. "And here she bought medical textbooks for students. She is helping others learn to help people just like her." Richard had started this experiment hoping to see good people do good things, but what was happening exceeded even his wildest expectations. Each woman had not only improved her own life but had become a source of hope for others. Nancy Williams had surprised herself the most. After paying off her student loans and fixing her car, she had felt a freedom she hadn't experienced since nursing school. But instead of buying expensive things for herself, she kept thinking about the nursing students she saw struggling at the hospital. She remembered working 3 jobs just to afford textbooks and wondering if she would ever make it through school. Last Tuesday, Nancy had walked into the nursing school dean's office with a proposal. "I want to start a fund for students who can't afford their books and supplies," she had said, placing a check for $15,000 on the desk. The dean had stared at the check in disbelief. "Miss Williams, this is incredibly generous, but are you sure you can afford this?" Nancy had smiled, thinking about the mysterious letter she kept framed on her kitchen wall. "Someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Now I want to do the same for others." Within weeks, the Nancy Williams Student Support Fund had helped 12 struggling students, but Nancy didn't stop there. She started showing up at the hospital on her days off, not to work but to spend time with patients who had no visitors. She brought books, magazines, and sometimes just sat and listened to their stories. Betty Martinez had taken a different approach. Working at the grocery store had shown her how many families struggled to put food on the table. She watched mothers count coins for milk, saw elderly customers put back items they needed because they couldn't afford everything on their lists. Betty had started small, quietly paying for groceries when customers came up short. But word began to spread through the community about the mysterious grocery store angel. Soon Betty was doing much more than covering shortfalls. "Mrs. Rodriguez, your total is 0 today," Betty would say with a wink to the single mother of 3 who worked 2 jobs but still struggled to feed her children. "But I have money," Mrs. Rodriguez would protest. "I know you do." But today, someone who cares about families wanted to help. "Take your kids out for ice cream instead." Betty had even convinced her manager to let her start a program where customers could buy extra groceries to be distributed to families in need. The community care cart had become so popular that other grocery stores in town were copying the idea. Grace Thompson had found her calling in home repairs. After fixing her own roof, she had looked around her neighborhood and noticed all the small problems that elderly or struggling homeowners couldn't afford to address. Leaky faucets, broken steps, peeling paint, cracked driveways. Grace had hired a local handyman, Joe, to work with her full-time fixing homes for free. Joe had been out of work for months before Grace offered him steady employment helping neighbors. "I never thought I'd be running a charity," Grace told her daughter during their weekly phone call. "But you know what? I wake up excited every day. Yesterday we fixed Mrs. Patterson's front porch so she can sit outside again." She cried when she saw it. Grace's project had grown into something the neighborhood called Grace's Angels. Volunteers had started joining her, and local hardware stores donated supplies. What started as one woman with a credit card had become a community movement. Linda Foster had transformed the library into something magical. With her mysterious funding, she had expanded the children's program in ways she had only dreamed about. But Linda's real breakthrough came when she started the adult literacy program. "Reading opens doors you never knew existed," Linda told her evening class of 12 adults who were learning to read. The oldest student was 72, the youngest was 19. All of them had been too embarrassed to seek help before Linda made it feel safe and welcoming. Linda had also started the Books for Everyone program, where she bought new books for families to keep permanently, not library books that had to be returned, but books that children could own, write their names in, and treasure forever. The program had grown so popular that Linda had to hire 2 part-time assistants. She had also convinced other libraries in the county to start similar programs, creating a network of literacy support that was changing lives across the region. Richard couldn't have been happier with what he was seeing in the monthly reports. But Mrs. Chen noticed something that Richard was too excited to see. "Mr. Morrison, these monthly deposits are getting very expensive," she said one evening as they reviewed the accounts. "Each woman is spending more and more as their programs grow." Richard waved off her concern. "Helen always said that money spent helping others is money well invested. Look how much good they're doing." "But sir, the deposits have gone from $50,000 per month per account to nearly $200,000. That's $800,000 every month." Richard paused in his reading. That much? Mrs. Chen showed him the calculations on her tablet. Nancy's student fund has helped over 100 students. Betty's grocery program feeds dozens of families every week. Grace has repaired 30 houses. Linda's literacy program served 200 people. It is wonderful, but what? Sir, at this rate, you will spend over $9 million this year just on the credit cards. And the programs are still growing. Richard looked at the numbers, and for a moment doubt crept into his mind. But then he looked at Helen's picture on his desk. She was wearing her volunteer badge from the children's hospital in the photo, smiling after reading stories to sick kids for 8 hours straight. Helen volunteered for 40 years. He said quietly, "She gave her time because we had money. Now I'm giving money so others can give their time. It's what she would want." But that night, Richard couldn't sleep. He walked through his empty house, calculating how long his savings would last at this rate. He had always been wealthy, but even his fortune had limits. If the women's programs kept growing, Mrs. Chen found him in the kitchen at 3 a.m, sitting at the table with financial documents spread around him. "Sir, you should sleep. Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something?" "Of course." Richard looked up at her with tired but determined eyes. "If you knew you could help hundreds of people but it would cost you everything you had, would you do it?" Mrs. Chen sat down across from him. She had seen this man at his worst after Helen died, and at his best as he watched the women spread kindness throughout their communities. "I think, sir, that Helen would be very proud of what you are doing, but she would also be worried about you." Richard nodded slowly. "I'm worried about me too, but I'm more worried about what happens if I stop. Nancy has students depending on her fund. Betty has families counting on her help. Grace has elderly neighbors who finally have safe homes. Linda has people learning to read for the first time in their lives. What will you do?" Richard gathered up the papers and stood up. "I'm going to keep my promise to those 4 women. Whatever it costs." What Richard didn't know was that his sacrifice was about to be discovered in a way he never expected, and the 4 women whose lives he had changed were about to change his life in return. Mrs. Chen had worked for the Morrison family long enough to know when something was wrong. It started with small things that might seem normal to someone else, but after 15 years of caring for Richard and Helen, she noticed everything. The expensive heart medication that Richard took every morning had disappeared from his bathroom cabinet. When she asked about it, he said his doctor had changed his prescription, but she never saw any new bottles appear. His monthly visits to his cardiologist had stopped. Mrs. Chen used to drive him to these appointments, but for the past 2 months Richard claimed they weren't necessary anymore. Most concerning of all, she had started finding him awake in his study at all hours of the night, surrounded by financial papers and looking exhausted. It was a Thursday morning in late October when Mrs. Chen made the discovery that changed everything. Richard had left for what he said was a business meeting, but something about his explanation didn't feel right. He seemed nervous, almost secretive. Mrs. Chen was organizing his study, a task Helen used to handle but had fallen to her after Helen's death. Richard kept his financial documents in a locked filing cabinet, but that morning, he had left it open with papers scattered across his desk. She wasn't trying to snoop. She was simply stacking the papers neatly when a letter from his investment firm caught her eye. The heading read, "Portfolio Liquidation Notice" in bold red letters. Her hands trembling, Mrs. Chen read the document. Richard had sold another $2 million in stocks and bonds last month. This was the 5th such liquidation notice she could see in the pile. Confused, she looked for his bank statements. What she found made her heart sink. Richard's primary savings account, which had held $12 million 6 months ago, now showed a balance of just under $4 million. His investment portfolio had been reduced by 60%. Even his emergency funds were nearly empty. But the most shocking discovery came when she found his personal checkbook. Richard had been writing himself checks from his remaining savings to deposit into the 4 credit card accounts. The amounts were staggering. $800,000 last month alone. Mrs. Chen sat down heavily in Richard's chair, trying to process what this meant. He wasn't funding the credit cards from his investment returns or some endless fortune. He was literally giving away his life savings to keep his promise to 4 women who had no idea what their kindness was costing him. She pulled out a calculator and did the math. At the current rate of spending, Richard would be completely broke within 6 months. Everything Helen and he had built over 50 years of marriage would be gone. That's when she found the medical bills. Hidden beneath the financial statements were past due notices from Richard's cardiologist, his pharmacy, and the hospital. He owed over $15,000 in medical bills and hadn't been taking his heart medication for 2 months because he claimed he couldn't afford it. Mrs. Chen felt sick. Richard was choosing between his health and his promise to help others. And he was choosing others. She remembered Helen's final words to her. "Please take care of him. Mrs. Chen, he won't take care of himself." That evening, when Richard returned from his mysterious meeting, Mrs. Chen watched him carefully. He looked tired and older than his 78 years. He moved slowly up the stairs, holding the handrail tighter than usual. "Mr. Morrison, did you take your heart medicine today?" she asked. "Of course," he replied, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Sir, I couldn't find the bottle to check if you need a refill." Richard paused on the stairs. I have it in my room. Don't worry about it," but Mrs. Chen was worried. She had been caring for people long enough to recognize the signs of someone hiding an illness. Richard's color wasn't good, and she had noticed him getting short of breath more easily. That night, she made a decision that went against everything she believed about privacy and respect for her employer. She called Richard's doctor. "Dr. Peterson, this is Mrs. Chen, Mr. Morrison's housekeeper. I'm calling because I'm worried about him." "I'm worried too," the doctor said. "Richard missed his last 2 appointments and he hasn't filled his prescriptions. When I tried to reach him, he said he was feeling fine and didn't need to come in. Doctor, can I ask you something confidentially? What happens if he stops taking his heart medication?" There was a long pause. "Mrs. Chen, Richard had a serious heart attack 3 years ago. The medication keeps his heart rhythm stable and prevents another attack. Without it," the doctor's voice trailed off. "Without it, what?" "Without it, he's at serious risk of another heart attack. Possibly fatal. He needs to be taking that medication every single day." Mrs. Chen thanked the doctor and hung up, her hands shaking. Richard wasn't just spending his money to help others. He was risking his life. The next morning, Mrs. Chen did something she had never done before. She followed Richard when he left the house. She watched from her car as he went to the bank, then to his financial advisor's office, and finally to a pharmacy where he stood looking at his prescription, but walked away without buying it. When Richard returned home that afternoon, he found Mrs. Chen waiting for him in his study with a cup of his favorite tea. "Sir, we need to talk," she said gently. "What about?" "About Nancy's student fund that has helped 137 nursing students. About Betty's grocery program that feeds 43 families every week. About Grace's home repair project that has fixed houses for 62 elderly neighbors. About Linda's literacy programs that have taught 186 adults to read." Richard looked puzzled. "How do you know all those specific numbers?" "Because I called them, sir. I called all 4 women this morning." Richard's face went pale. "You did what?" "I told them I was conducting a survey about community programs. I wanted to understand exactly how much good you are doing." Mrs. Chen pulled out a notebook filled with her handwriting. "Do you want to know what else I learned?" Richard sat down slowly, looking suddenly fragile. "Nancy told me about the man who came to the hospital last week, an elderly gentleman who paid for a young mother's surgery when her insurance was denied. The man wouldn't give his name, but Nancy said he looked familiar. She thought maybe she had seen him visiting someone who died recently." Richard's eyes widened. "Betty told me about the anonymous donor who paid for groceries for 20 families last week when the food pantry ran out of supplies. A man who knew exactly which families needed help most. Grace mentioned the stranger who hired her handyman crew to fix the community center's roof. She said the man specifically asked that the work be done in memory of someone named Helen. And Linda spoke about the benefactor who bought $5,000 worth of books for the library's new children's wing. Books chosen specifically for kids who are learning English as a second language, just like Helen used to help." Mrs. Chen leaned forward, her eyes full of tears. "Sir, you're not just funding their programs. You're personally adding to them. You're doubling your own generosity." Richard tried to speak, but no words came. "Mr. Morrison, you are going to run out of money in 5 months. But more importantly, you are going to run out of life if you don't start taking care of yourself." Richard looked at her with the expression of a man who had been caught doing something he wasn't ashamed of, but wasn't ready to explain. "Mrs. Chen, those 4 women brought light into Helen's darkest days. If helping them cost me everything I have, then that's what Helen would want me to do. Sir, what Helen would want is for you to be alive to see the good you're doing. That night, Mrs. Chen lay awake planning something she had never attempted before. Something that would require courage, careful timing, and a little bit of hope that the 4 women Richard had helped were as good as he believed them to be. Mrs. Chen had never been so nervous in her life. She sat in the coffee shop downtown, waiting for Nancy to arrive. It had taken her 3 days to work up the courage to make the phone calls, and another 2 days to arrange this meeting. Nancy walked in wearing her scrubs, looking tired after another long shift. She spotted Mrs. Chen immediately and walked over with a confused smile. "You said on the phone that you knew about my credit card?" Nancy asked, sitting down across from her. Mrs. Chen took a deep breath. "Nancy, what I'm about to tell you might shock you, but I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." For the next 20 minutes, Mrs. Chen told Nancy everything about Richard Morrison, the lonely widower who had lost his beloved wife Helen, about how Nancy's kindness during Helen's treatments had meant more to them than she could ever know, about the unlimited credit cards being Richard's way of saying thank you. Nancy's eyes filled with tears as she listened. "But there's more," Mrs. Chen continued. "Richard is spending himself into poverty to keep funding your programs. He's stopped taking his heart medication because he can't afford it anymore. He's risking his life because he believes your kindness deserves to be rewarded." Nancy covered her mouth with her hands. "Oh my God, I had no idea. I never wanted." "How much has he spent?" "Over $7 million in 6 months. And he's not stopping. He'd rather die broke than break his promise to you and the other 3 women. "Other 3 women?" Mrs. Chen explained about Betty, Grace, and Linda. About how Richard had chosen 4 women who had shown genuine kindness to him and Helen, and how all 4 had used their gifts to help others. "I need to meet them," Nancy said immediately. "We need to fix this." The next evening, all 4 women gathered in Grace's living room. Mrs. Chen had spent the day telling each woman the same story, and now they sat together in stunned silence. "So the mysterious benefactor who's been changing our lives is actually the sad old man from the grocery store," Betty said softly. "The one whose wife used to buy that special oatmeal. And he's killing himself to help us help others," Grace added, shaking her head in disbelief. Linda, ever practical, had brought a notebook. "Mrs. Chen, what exactly does he need? Medical bills, medication, what else?" Mrs. Chen showed them the list she had prepared. "His immediate medical needs are about $20,000. But honestly, ladies, what he needs most is what you've all created for others. Community, family, people who care whether he's taking his medicine and eating his meals." Nancy leaned forward. "How much money has he spent on each of our programs?" "Each account has had about $1.8 million deposited over 6 months. But he's also been making personal donations on top of that. He's probably spent close to $2 million on each of you." $8 million, Grace whispered. "He's given away $8 million because we were nice to him and his wife." "Ladies," Mrs. Chen said, "I have an idea, but it's going to require all of us working together, and it might be the most important thing any of us ever do." 2 days later, Richard was in his study reviewing bills when Mrs. Chen knocked on the door. "Sir, there are some people here to see you. I'm not expecting anyone." "Mrs. Chen, can they come back another time?" "Sir, I think you should see these visitors." Reluctantly, Richard followed Mrs. Chen to the living room. When he walked in, he found 4 women sitting on his couches looking at him with expressions of gratitude, concern, and determination. He recognized them immediately. Nancy in her nurse's uniform, having come straight from work. Betty with flour on her apron from baking bread early that morning. Grace with dirt under her fingernails from working in her garden. Linda with a stack of books beside her chair, as always. "Mr. Morrison," Nancy said, standing up. "We know who you are. We know what you've done, and we need to talk." Richard looked at Mrs. Chen with betrayal in his eyes. "You told them?" "Yes, sir, I did. Because Helen asked me to take care of you, and I can't do that alone." Betty stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, in the past 6 months, I've helped feed over 200 families. Grace has repaired 60 homes. Linda has taught 200 people to read. Nancy has helped hundreds of nursing students and patients." "That's wonderful," Richard said, confused about why they were here. "It's wonderful because of you," Grace said. "But it's also killing you, literally." Nancy pulled out a prescription bottle. This is your heart medication. The medication you haven't taken in 2 months because you've given away the money you need to stay alive. Richard started to protest, but Linda interrupted him. Mr. Morrison, we did the math. At the rate our programs are growing, you'll be bankrupt in 4 months. Dead probably sooner if you don't start taking care of yourself. Ladies, I appreciate your concern, but no, Betty said firmly. You don't get to butt us. You don't get to sacrifice your life for our programs. Grace pulled out an envelope. This is a check for $2 million. It's every penny that's been spent on my home repair program plus interest. Nancy pulled out another envelope. This is my check. Same amount. Betty and Linda did the same. We're paying you back, Nancy said. Every single dollar. Richard stared at the check, speechless. But more importantly, Linda continued, we're not letting you live alone anymore. Mrs. Chen stepped forward with a smile. Sir, meet your new family, Betty grinned. I'm bringing you fresh meals every Tuesday and Friday. Don't even think about arguing, Grace nodded. I'm handling all your home maintenance. No more putting off repairs because you think you can't afford them. Nancy held up the prescription bottle. I'm your personal health advocate. Doctor appointments, medications, everything. And I'll know if you skip anything because I work with your doctor now. Linda gestured to her stack of books. And I'm bringing you books every week. Helen told me you used to love mystery novels but stopped reading after she died. We're fixing that. Richard looked around the room at the 4 women who had somehow become his family. I don't understand. How did you get the money to pay me back? Our programs raised it, Nancy explained. When we told the people we've been helping who their real benefactor was, they insisted on contributing. The nursing students, the families Betty feeds, the neighbors Grace has helped, the people Linda taught to read. Turns out, Grace said with tears in her eyes, when you help people, they want to help you back. Who knew? Betty laughed. The community raised $12 million in 4 days. They gave more than enough to pay you back and keep all our programs running without your money. But we're keeping the credit cards, Linda added quickly. Because we're not done spreading kindness. We're just doing it smarter now, with community support instead of one man's life savings. Richard sat down heavily, overwhelmed. But why? Why would you do this for me? Nancy knelt beside his chair. Mr. Morrison, you gave us the power to help others, but what you really gave us was hope. You showed us that kindness matters, that generosity creates more generosity, and that one person really can change the world. Helen was right, Grace added softly. Money is just paper unless it helps someone smile. You helped us learn how to make others smile. Now it's our turn to make you smile. Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes. Sir, Helen would be so proud. You created exactly what she always believed in. A community of people who take care of each other. Richard looked around the room at his unlikely family. For the first time since Helen's death, the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of love, laughter, and the promise of many more days spent in the company of people who cared about him. Mrs. Chen, he said quietly, I think Helen would say this turned out exactly as she planned. Helen was right, Grace added softly. Money is just paper unless it helps someone smile. You helped us learn how to make others smile. Now it's our turn to make you smile. Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes. Sir, Helen would be so proud. You created exactly what she always believed in. A community of people who take care of each other. Richard looked around the room at his unlikely family. For the first time since Helen's death, the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of love, laughter, and the promise of many more days spent in the company of people who cared about him. Mrs. Chen, he said quietly, I think Helen would say this turned out exactly as she planned. 6 months later, Richard's house had become the unofficial headquarters for 4 thriving community programs. A man who had learned to accept help as gracefully as he gave it, and a caretaker whose unbelievable act of love had created something more valuable than money could ever buy. A real family, chosen and cherished by choice.